A doctor punched a nurse and kicked her out after slapping a patient. Everyone assumed it was her fault. But in the morning, a video emerged that changed everything. Subscribe to the channel and post in the comments where you're watching from. The soft hum of fluorescent lights echoed through the sterile hallways of the Sterling Medical Pavilion, a name spoken with reverence in the city's elite circles. Floors gleamed with antiseptic perfection, and the air carried the faintest trace of lavender, an intentional touch to mask the sharpness of chemicals. The reception area boasted polished marble counters, abstract art in muted blues and grays, and a coffee station that rivaled those of boutique hotels. On the surface, everything was impeccable, calculated to exude calm and competence. Beneath it, however, was something colder, less visible, but unmistakably real to those who weren't invited to sit at the proverbial table. Kiara James walked the corridor in her crisp navy scrubs, clipboard in hand, her posture upright, her stride purposeful. She had grown accustomed to the sideways glances, the micro-pauses in conversation when she entered a room, the subtle clench of a colleague's jaw when she offered a suggestion. She wasn't imagining them. She had learned long ago to trust her instincts. In the 6 years since she'd started working at Sterling, not a single other black woman had joined the medical staff. There were black custodians, black security guards, but none in a lab coat or uniform like hers. Her very presence was a disruption in a place that prided itself on discretion and pedigree. Still, Kiara persevered. She had not clawed her way through nursing school, night shifts, and unpaid internships just to fade into the background. Her mother hadn't worked 2 jobs for a decade so her daughter could be invisible. Kiara carried that resolve with her like a second skin, even on the days when the weight of it threatened to pull her under. She paused at room 312, glanced down at her notes, and knocked twice before opening the door. A silver nameplate read, Mr. Arthur Dillon, 68. New admission, post-op recovery following a complex knee reconstruction. When she stepped inside, the first thing she noticed was the quiet, a peculiar sort of quiet that didn't come from sedation but from arrogance. The man sitting in the motorized wheelchair by the window was staring directly at her. He was tall, or had been once, with a broad chest now soft under a designer sweater vest. His white hair was meticulously combed, his shoes polished to a military shine, despite being confined to the chair. A gold ring glinted on his finger. His expression was a mixture of mild interest and thinly veiled amusement, like a man appraising a hotel concierge or a room service menu. "You're not what I expected," he said, his voice gravelly but strong. Kiara gave him a professional smile. "Good afternoon, Mr. Dillon. I'm Kiara James, your assigned nurse. I'll be checking your vitals and assisting you during your stay." He made a show of scanning her from head to toe. "Kiara," he repeated slowly, as if tasting the syllables. "Lovely name. Exotic." She had heard that word more times than she could count. Exotic. Not beautiful, not strong, always something other. She didn't respond to the comment, instead approaching him with her tablet and beginning her routine. Blood pressure, pulse, oxygen saturation. He offered no resistance physically, but the air thickened with his gaze, which lingered longer than necessary on her neckline, her hands, her hips. "You've got a gentle touch," he remarked when she fastened the blood pressure cuff. "I've had practice," she replied evenly. He chuckled, but there was no warmth in the sound. "I bet you have." That first encounter might have ended there, just another uneasy moment in a career littered with them, but Kiara felt it. A spark of something darker behind his flippant tone, something calculating. The following day she found him in the hallway near the nurse's station, asking a junior nurse where Kiara had gone. He said it casually, pretending to squint at the signage as though he'd forgotten his room number. But when Kiara returned from another call, she caught him watching her from behind the potted ficus near the water fountain. Not overtly. Just enough for her to notice and question whether it was deliberate. She told herself not to make a scene. Not yet. By the end of the week, the pattern was unmistakable. He requested her specifically for bedpan changes, sponge baths, and dressing reapplication, even when male nurses or physical therapists were on duty. He made offhand comments about her figure, cloaking them in mock compliments. "You must turn a lot of heads," he'd said once when she leaned over to adjust his footrest. "Do they let pretty girls like you do the real medical work, or just the show stuff?" Kiara froze, her jaw tightening. "Sir, please keep your hands at your sides," she said coolly, noticing how his fingers inched toward her wrist. "Just being friendly," he replied, smile wide. Later that afternoon, she logged the interaction in her private journal app on her phone, marking the time and a brief summary. She had started the practice years ago after a particularly vile incident during an internship when a surgeon's words had bordered on a proposition. The entry had read simply, "Dr. Mason," or two, said, "Bet you're used to holding big tools." She hadn't reported it then. She'd only been a student. But she wasn't a student anymore. By the second week, the tension had grown unbearable. Every shift, she walked into the clinic bracing for some new display of Dylan's boundary pushing. She no longer lingered after hours or joined group lunches. Even some of the other nurses noticed her withdrawal, though they attributed it to stress or lack of sleep. On Thursday morning, Kiara requested a brief meeting with Dr. Richard Harper, the medical director. She'd worked under him since day one. He was tall, meticulous, and always gave the impression of someone whose handshake could seal million-dollar deals. He wasn't openly hostile, but he never went out of his way to include her in initiatives or give her leadership tasks despite her tenure. She met him in his office, a glass-walled chamber overlooking the West Garden, filled with medical textbooks arranged by color rather than subject. "I'm concerned about a patient," she began, folding her hands in her lap. "Mr. Dillon, he's been inappropriate with me, repeatedly." Harper raised an eyebrow, then sighed and leaned back. "Inappropriate how?" She described the incidents calmly, factually. She didn't exaggerate. She didn't dramatize. When she finished, he was silent for a moment. "Kiara," he said finally, "Arthur Dillon is a retired board member of one of our largest donors. He's an old man, alone. A little flirtation, while not ideal, is probably his way of feeling human again." She blinked. "Sir, this is not flirtation. I understand. But unless there's something physical or overt..." He paused. "Just document everything. We can't make assumptions. I have documented it." He looked briefly uncomfortable, then waved a hand. "Let's not make this bigger than it is. Just stay professional. Don't overreact. You're one of our best nurses, Kiara. Don't jeopardize that over a misunderstanding." She left the office with her heart pounding, not from fear, but fury. Misunderstanding. The word echoed in her skull like a curse. She thought she might cry, but didn't. Not here. Not where the walls had ears and silence was a performance. Outside, the rain had started to fall, faint at first, then steadier. It tapped against the skylights as if to remind her the world was still turning, still blind. In the locker room, she sat on the bench, staring at her name tag. The letters gleamed under the fluorescent bulbs, crisp and clean, but she felt dirty, tainted. Not because of Dillon, not even because of Harper, because she had stayed silent too long. She told herself it wouldn't happen again. And deep inside, a fire began to stir. Not the kind that burns out in anger, but the kind that smolders with purpose. It was only a matter of time. The next few days passed like slow-moving storm clouds, heavy with anticipation, their darkness seeping into every corner of Kiara's mind. Each step she took through the pristine corridors of Sterling Medical Pavilion felt more like walking a tightrope over open fire. She arrived early and left late, not out of duty, but from an ever-growing sense of unease. The same walls she once moved through with quiet pride now felt alien, even hostile. Arthur Dillon had not relented. If anything, her conversation with Dr. Harper seemed to have emboldened him. His touches became more frequent, his tone more suggestive, and his eyes followed her with the same glinting amusement that made her skin crawl. On Friday morning, as Kiara walked into his room to deliver medications, she found him reclining slightly in his wheelchair, dressed in one of his cashmere cardigans and a deep burgundy ascot. Always overdressed for a hospital room, always performative. He greeted her with a smile that looked carved from granite. "Miss James," he said with a mock flourish, "the angel returns." Kiara ignored the comment and busied herself at the bedside cart, preparing the tablets and recording his vitals on her tablet. "Care to help me with the straps again?" he asked casually, gesturing at the safety belt across his lap. She hesitated. That request had become routine, always framed as a simple need for assistance. But every time his hand would slip. It would brush against her arm or her thigh or worse, her waist, fingers lingering like the last leaf before winter. "I'll send another nurse," she said without turning, her voice calm but firm. "No need," he replied, raising an eyebrow. "I prefer your hands, softer." She turned to face him, medication cup in hand. "This isn't appropriate, Mr. Dillon. Please refrain from comments like that." "Oh, forgive me," he said, raising both hands in mock surrender. "Didn't mean to ruffle your feathers, darling. Just a compliment." She didn't respond. Instead, she handed him the pills and made a mental note of the time. 10:42 a.m., medication administered, inappropriate language, another entry for her log, another drop in the storm. Later that afternoon, during her break, Kiara returned to Dr. Harper's office with her tablet. This time, she didn't ask for a meeting. She knocked once and stepped inside without waiting. He was seated behind his desk, as always, reviewing patient charts. He looked up, surprised. "I need to speak with you again," she said. His face shifted slightly. Not annoyed, he was too controlled for that, but there was a definite pause, a flicker of inconvenience. "Regarding Mr. Dillon again, I assume?" "Yes," she said. "His behavior hasn't stopped. In fact, it's escalated. Today, he made another request for physical assistance and followed it with an inappropriate comment." Harper closed the folder he was reviewing and leaned back in his chair. "I understand your concern, Kiara," he began, his tone deliberate. "But we've talked about this, unless there's a direct threat or physical assault." "There is a pattern," she cut in, sharper than she intended. "A clear one, and I've documented everything." "Documentation isn't evidence," he said, a trace of impatience bleeding through. "Look, I know this is frustrating, but Dillon has a long history with this clinic. He's contributed more than most to its current reputation. He's been through several procedures, and we've never had complaints. He's a lonely man. If he said something that felt off color, I'm sure he meant no harm." "No harm?" Kiara repeated, barely able to contain her disbelief. "So, because he's old, wealthy, and white, he gets a pass? He can do and say whatever he wants to me? "Watch your tone, Nurse James," Harper said sharply, his posture stiffening. "This isn't about race." "But it always is," she said softly, "even when you pretend it isn't." He didn't answer. The silence that followed was like lead in her chest. She left without another word. That evening, as the city bathed in the orange glow of streetlights, Kiara sat alone on the edge of her bed, laptop open beside her, document file growing longer by the minute. She reread her notes, the times, the language, the body language, the witnesses, always peripheral, never intervening. She stared at the last line she had written, asked for strap help, called me darling, refused second nurse. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard. Then, slowly, she typed another sentence. "Tomorrow, I will not stay silent again." On Saturday, the clinic was busier than usual. A scheduled visiting physician had canceled, and the ER had sent 2 referrals for cardiac testing. Kiara was tasked with monitoring patient rounds on the 3rd floor, which included Dylan's room. As she reviewed charts at the nurse's station, she felt a shadow move across her peripheral vision. When she looked up, it was him. Arthur Dillon, in his chair, rolling slowly down the hallway, his smile as smug as ever. "There she is," he announced loud enough for 2 other nurses to hear. "My favorite Florence Nightingale." Kiara didn't respond. She turned back to her screen. He wheeled closer. "I had a little spill with the blanket again," he said. "Mind tucking me in?" Nurse Amy, a newly transferred tech from Midtown, raised an eyebrow and looked at Kiara. "Want me to handle that?" Kiara shook her head. "No, it's fine." In his room, she moved quickly, retrieving the blanket from the chair and folding it over his lap without touching him. But as she leaned forward to straighten the edges, his hand darted out, faster than she expected for a man claiming weakness, and grabbed her wrist. Not hard, not bruising, but it lingered, intimate, invasive. "Missed your smile this morning," he said, eyes locking onto hers. Kiara yanked her arm back. "Don't ever touch me again," she said, her voice trembling with fury. He only grinned. She turned and walked straight to the nurse's station. She wrote the report, formal this time, and submitted it to administration through the internal complaint system. A red notification pinged on the screen. "Your report has been received." She exhaled. But the following day, nothing happened. No call from HR, no inquiry, no follow-up. Worse still, at the Monday morning staff briefing, Dr. Harper made a brief announcement thanking Mr. Dillon for his continued generosity and support, and reminded staff to exercise patience and compassion with our elderly clients. The room felt like it had tilted sideways. Kiara stood in the back, surrounded by nodding heads and polite applause, her insides churning. That night, she cried in the shower, hot water rushing over her as if it could wash away the contamination of being unseen, unheard. Her body, which she had always trusted to carry her through every hard shift, every endless night, felt foreign. Her own skin had become a battlefield. The next day, she told herself, if he touched her again, just once, she wouldn't hesitate. No more warnings, no more polite restraint. The line had already been crossed. Now she would draw her own. Tuesday began like any other, bathed in the early light of a crisp morning, but Kiara James felt the charge in the air before she even stepped into the building. There was an edge to everything, subtle but unmistakable, as though the walls themselves were holding their breath. The night before had been sleepless. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Arthur Dillon's hand reaching for her, felt again the chill of his fingers on her wrist. She had reported him through the official channel, written the most detailed complaint of her career, And yet nothing had changed. Not one word from administration. No investigation. No support. She arrived at Sterling Medical Pavilion just before 7, her uniform pressed, her badge clipped at an exact angle. The front desk staff greeted her with nods, polite, distant. She was invisible again. A nurse in the corner, one of the newer hires, offered a tight smile before quickly averting her eyes. Word had begun to circulate, though no one dared speak it aloud. Everyone knew something, but no one wanted to know too much. The halls felt longer than usual as Kiara walked toward the third-floor station. She checked the board. Dylan was still in room 312, still under her care. Harper had made no reassignment, despite her repeated concerns. Her stomach churned, but she steadied herself. It would be routine. Check vitals, administer medication, leave the room, no opportunity, no contact. But that wasn't how it happened. She entered the room at 7:42 a.m. The lights were dimmed as always, and Dylan was already awake, dressed in a button-down shirt and khaki slacks that someone must have helped him into. He sat in his chair by the window, his eyes locked on the door even before she opened it, as though he'd been waiting. "Right on time," he said smoothly. "Punctuality's a lost art." Kiara didn't answer. She crossed the room to the tray by his bed, checked his charts, logged the new medication dose, and approached with the pill cup. Her movements were precise, robotic. She didn't look at his face. He took the cup from her hand, but didn't immediately raise it to his lips. "I think we got off on the wrong foot yesterday," he said. "I was only trying to be friendly." "I'm here to provide care, Mr. Dillon," she replied without emotion. "Please take your medication." He did, still watching her. "You know, you're not like the others. There's a fire in you. That's why I like you." Kiara turned to walk away. And then it happened. He dropped his handkerchief to the floor and made a show of reaching down awkwardly. "Damn arthritis," he muttered. "Could you help me with that?" She turned instinctively. The handkerchief was lying just under his footrest. Against her better judgment, she stepped forward and knelt slightly to pick it up. As she rose, his hand shot out, not for the cloth, but for her waist. This time there was no ambiguity, no mistaking it for anything but what it was. His fingers pressed into her hip and then slid inward toward her abdomen. A flash of heat surged through her chest. Her pulse exploded in her ears. Without thinking, Kiara reacted. She slapped him. It was swift, reflexive, born not of rage, but pure survival. Her open palm connected with the side of his face with a sharp crack that echoed through the quiet room. He gasped and reeled back, more from shock than pain. The moment froze, the sunlight through the blinds, the pill cup tipping from his lap, the widening of his eyes as he reached up to touch his reddening cheek. And then came the noise. A low moan, a dramatic groan, the beginnings of a theatrical collapse into his chair. Dylan's performance was instantaneous. "She hit me," he called out, louder now as if announcing a crime. "I was just asking for help and she struck me. Someone, get someone." Within seconds, footsteps thundered down the hallway. 2 nurses and a tech appeared in the doorway, and behind them, like a signal sent by fate, came Dr. Harper, flanked by a clipboard and the scowl he reserved for emergencies. "What's going on here?" he barked. Dylan was already halfway into his act, holding his face, shaking his head in mock disbelief. "She hit me. I reached for a handkerchief and she just struck me." Harper turned to Kiara. "Is this true?" Kiara's chest was heaving, her fist clenched. "He grabbed me. Again, I was defending myself. Harper's eyes narrowed. In front of a patient? In front of a predator, she said. Gasps rippled from the staff behind him. That's enough, Harper snapped. Step out, now. Are you serious? Kiara's voice rose, the edge of panic beginning to creep in. You've known about this for weeks. I filed a report. Out. He stepped forward and shoved the air between them with his hand, a gesture as cold as it was final. His eyes were steel. In that moment, there was no doubt. He had made his choice. Kiara took a step back. Her body was trembling, not from fear, but from disbelief. She looked around the room. No one moved. No one spoke. She turned and walked out. Minutes later, as she sat in the break room trying to calm her racing heart, 2 security guards appeared. Miss James, one said awkwardly, we need to escort you off the premises. For what? She asked, even though she knew the answer. No details, the other mumbled. Administrative orders. As they led her through the hallway, past the nurse's station, past the waiting patients, past her colleagues, some of whom looked away, some of whom whispered, Kiara felt a strange numbness settle over her. Not shame, not guilt, something heavier, something colder. They didn't just escort her out. They walked her through the lobby, past the reception desk, out through the double doors with the Sterling logo etched into glass. The doors closed behind her like the lid of a coffin. Outside, the morning sun had risen high. It was warm, almost beautiful. She stood there for a long time, watching as people passed her by, unknowing, uncaring. She took out her phone. There were already messages, colleagues, co-workers, some sympathetic, most vague. Heard what happened. Hope you're okay. Don't give up. You're better than that place. But nothing from Harper, nothing from administration. She walked home that day. She needed the time, the motion, the silence. The streets blurred around her as memories surged. Her first day at Sterling, her excitement, her pride. All of it tarnished now, crushed under the weight of a single moment, a single slap. At home, she sat in the dark for hours, her scrubs still on, her badge still clipped to her chest. In her mind, the scene replayed on an endless loop. His hand, her slap, the betrayal in Harper's voice. She looked down at her hand, the one that had struck him. It didn't feel like a weapon. It had never been one. It had been a shield. And somehow, for that, she had been condemned. As night fell, Kiara stared out the window of her apartment, city lights blinking like indifferent stars. Somewhere in the distance, she heard sirens. Somewhere, someone else was being told to stay quiet, to accept, to submit. She promised herself, right then, she wouldn't be one of them. Not anymore. In the days that followed her expulsion from Sterling Medical Pavilion, Kiara James existed in a kind of limbo. Time passed, but not in a way she could measure. The hours bled into one another, and daylight meant little more than the shape of shadows shifting across her apartment walls. Her body followed familiar routines: wake, sit, shower, stare. But her mind was adrift, circling the same memories, the same moment, over and over like a reel she couldn't switch off. She had expected anger, fury even, but what she felt was more insidious. It was silence. Not the silence of peace or reflection, but the kind that hums inside you like static. The kind that follows a fall when you lie dazed and breathless, waiting for someone to help you up. But no one comes. She didn't tell her mother the full story at first. When they spoke on the phone, Kiara said she was taking a short break from the clinic, that she needed time to rest. Her mother didn't press, only said that she was proud of her and reminded her to eat something, anything, even if it was just soup. Kiara nodded. promised she would. But the truth sat like a stone in her throat. The apartment, usually a place of order and calm, had become cluttered with unopened mail and half-finished cups of tea. The certificate that had once hung so proudly above her desk, registered nurse with distinction, now lay face down on the floor where it had slipped from the wall. She hadn't bothered to pick it up. Her phone buzzed periodically with messages from former colleagues. Most were hesitant, carefully worded, as though the writers were afraid to say too much. "Hey, thinking of you. Hope you're okay. Let me know if you need anything. I don't know what happened exactly, but I believe you." Some messages were from people she barely knew, others from those she had laughed with in break rooms, shared late shifts with, covered for when their kids were sick, and yet not one of them had spoken up when she was dragged out of the clinic like a criminal. They had watched in silence, just like they had watched Arthur Dillon's hands wander, and watched Dr. Harper's fury land on her like a gavel. No one had said a word. On the third day, she received a formal letter from Sterling's legal department. It was cold and precise, written in a language designed to strip emotion from brutality. It stated that her employment had been terminated effective immediately due to misconduct, that an internal review had concluded her actions were incompatible with the values of the institution, and that any further contact would be handled through legal channels. She read it once, then again. Her hands trembled as she folded the paper back into the envelope and dropped it into the trash. The blow didn't land all at once. It came in waves. First the shame, then the disbelief, and then the realization. She had been erased, just like that. 6 years of dedication, of tireless shifts, of caring for patients no one else wanted to deal with. Gone. For what? For defending herself. She wanted to scream, but the anger wouldn't come. Not yet. Only the silence. Each night, sleep eluded her. When she did manage to doze off, she woke, gasping, as if drowning. Her dreams were filled with corridors that led nowhere, doors that slammed shut, voices that whispered from behind glass. She would see Harper's face, stern and unreadable, hear his voice booming the word out like a gunshot. She would see Dillon's grin, the way his hand had curled around her body like a brand. She deleted her social media accounts after she began seeing headlines. Small at first, but spreading. Local blogs, then health news forums. Nurse assaults elderly patient in respected city clinic. Sterling staff member dismissed after incident with donor. No one mentioned the word harassment. No one mentioned racial bias or gendered power dynamics. Just nurse and assault. Just her face, captured from the staff directory, cropped and flattened like she was a suspect in a crime. She had no voice in the story they were telling. By the end of the week, Kiara had stopped opening her blinds. She sat in the dark, replaying every choice she had made, wondering if she could have done anything differently. Should she have walked away? Should she have gone to the press earlier? Should she have kept quiet? But every time those thoughts crept in, something deeper rose to meet them. A knowledge, not just of what she had endured, but of what had been taken from her. Her dignity, her livelihood, her safety, and worse, her belief that the system would protect her if she did the right thing. That illusion had shattered. She called one of the nurses who had messaged her, a woman named Carla, who had always seemed fair, if not exactly close. "I don't know what to say," Carla confessed. "Everyone's scared. Harper, he made it clear there'd be consequences if anyone questioned the decision." "So you all just accepted it?" Kiara asked, her voice steady. "It's not that simple." "It never is," Kiara replied, "until it is." The call ended in awkward silence. On Sunday evening, Kiara's mother arrived unannounced. She had taken the overnight bus and stood at the door with 2 bags and a look of quiet determination. When Kiara opened the door, her mother stepped inside without a word and wrapped her arms around her daughter. For the first time since that morning in Dylan's room, Kiara let herself cry. They didn't speak much that night. Her mother made soup, cleaned the kitchen, swept the floors. She didn't ask for details, didn't press. She just stayed. And in her presence, Kiara felt something shift. Not hope, not yet, but the first stirrings of it. Later, curled on the couch with a blanket over her legs, Kiara opened her laptop and pulled up her documentation. All the notes she had taken over the past weeks, each entry carefully dated and logged. She added one more. March 12th, escorted out of Sterling. Accused without investigation. No due process. No one listened. But I'm still here. She stared at the words. They were not enough, but they were something. She opened a new document. Title, Formal Statement of Events, Kiara James. She began to write. The next morning, she called a lawyer. By Tuesday, she had connected with a local advocacy group for healthcare workers experiencing discrimination. By Wednesday, she had spoken to a journalist, off the record, but with the promise of truth. By the end of the week, she had done what Sterling had hoped she wouldn't. She began to speak. By the time Kiara stood outside the downtown offices of the Health Workers Advocacy Alliance, spring had begun to stir in the city. The air carried a softness that hinted at renewal, though the bite of winter still lingered. The building was modest, wedged between a florist and a family-run cafe, but it radiated something rare and necessary: intent. Inside, the walls were plastered with posters declaring solidarity, safety, and rights, and the receptionist, an older black woman with silver-streaked braids and eyes that held years of witnessing, greeted her with warmth and a cup of peppermint tea. Kiara wasn't sure what she expected. Perhaps more forms, more cold bureaucracy, more polite nods and empty assurances. Instead, she was ushered into a room where 2 women waited for her. One, a lawyer named Julia Grant, sharp-eyed and calm, and the other, a community organizer named Leslie, whose quiet presence carried a gravity that didn't need volume to assert itself. They listened, not politely, not performatively. They listened like people who had heard too many stories like hers and still managed to care. Kiara recounted everything, from the first time Arthur Dillon leered at her to the moment Harper's voice cracked through the room like a judge's verdict. Her voice didn't shake. She was beyond shame now. When she finished, there was a long silence. Leslie nodded slowly, then asked, "Do you have documentation?" Kiara opened her bag and pulled out a thick folder. Inside were pages of logs, dates, direct quotes, and screen captures from internal reports. She also handed over her phone, already cued to the voice note she had recorded after being removed from the building, detailing everything in raw, unfiltered detail. Julia skimmed the documents and then looked up. "This is thorough. Have you spoken to the press?" "Not officially. A journalist reached out after one of the blogs picked up the story. I said I'd think about it." "You should consider it," Julia said, "but do it carefully. They'll try to twist it. You'll be painted as bitter, angry, emotional." "I am angry," Kiara replied. "Good," Leslie said. "Use it, but channel it." Over the next several days, they worked together on building a case, not just a legal one, but a human one. Kiara gave her full statement to the Department of Labor's Workplace Harassment Division. She contacted the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission and filed formal charges, and she gave a recorded interview to a local independent media channel known for investigative reporting. Her name was kept anonymous at first. Her face blurred, but her voice rang clear. A week later, the video aired. It wasn't sensational. There were no dramatic music cues, no reenactments. Just Kiara's voice over B-roll of hospital corridors, staff walking, nurses laughing softly at the edges of their fatigue. Her words stood on their own. I was a nurse for 6 years. I believed in my clinic. I trusted my supervisors, and when I was harassed by a patient, I did what I was taught to do. I reported it. I followed the rules. I gave them a chance to protect me, and they failed. It took only 2 days for the video to gain traction. The internet has a way of tearing things open when truth touches something deep. People began to share it, first quietly within healthcare forums and nurses' networks, then more widely. Hashtags began to trend. Former employees of Sterling added cryptic comments under anonymous profiles, some confirming similar experiences, others expressing guilt for not speaking up. Then came the unexpected crack in the silence. A message arrived in Kiara's inbox from Tess Monroe, a former patient she vaguely remembered. Early 20s, light brown hair, used to bring a sketch pad with her to appointments. The message was short. I think I have something you need to see. They met the next morning at a cafe just outside the city. Tess arrived clutching her phone like it was a weapon. She looked nervous but determined. I was in the hallway the day it happened, she said. I was recording a video for my blog. I didn't mean to catch it. I was talking about the clinic's artwork or something, but I saw him grab you. I didn't realize what I had until I watched it again. She played the video. The clip was short but damning. It showed Kiara kneeling to retrieve the handkerchief. Dylan's hand reaching, unmistakably, deliberately, for her waist. The angle was partial, but clear enough. Her flinch, the slap, his reaction, delayed, dramatic. It wasn't even subtle. Kiara watched it 3 times. Her heart didn't race. Her breath didn't catch. She felt only clarity. "Can I use this?" she asked. Tess nodded. "Please. I should have said something sooner." Within hours, the footage was uploaded to the same independent channel. This time, Kiara agreed to show her face. The response was immediate and seismic. The narrative shifted overnight. Suddenly, the slap was no longer an assault. It was defense. The predator was no longer faceless. It was Arthur Dillon, now with his image circulating alongside headlines like "Sterling Clinic Under Fire for Ignoring Nurses' Harassment Complaints." Dr. Harper's face began to appear in articles. His history was dredged up. Several unexplored complaints about favoritism, racially biased performance reviews, and a reputation for protecting high-value donors. People demanded answers. Outside Sterling's gates, protests formed, small at first, then swelling. Nurses stood holding signs. "Believe nurses. Believe black women." Medical students marched with them. Former patients shared their support. Kiara stood at the edge of the crowd one afternoon, watching as the place she had once served with pride was now under siege. It didn't feel like vengeance. It felt like balance being restored. 3 days later, a formal investigation was announced by the state medical board. That same night, police arrived at Dillon's residence. The video evidence, combined with Kiara's testimony and previous reports of inappropriate conduct at other facilities, was enough to justify an arrest for sexual battery and misconduct against a healthcare worker. His mugshot appeared on the news before midnight. The man, who once smirked with impunity, now looked frightened, small. When Julia called to tell her, Kiara didn't cry. She didn't smile. She simply closed her eyes and exhaled. The next morning, she was invited to speak on national television. "We can do it remotely," the producer said. "You don't even have to show your face." But Kiara did. She sat before the camera, spine straight, voice steady. "I didn't speak up because I wanted attention," she said. "I spoke up because I was tired of being quiet. Tired of knowing that if I didn't, someone else would walk into that clinic and face the same thing. I wanted to be heard. And now I am." The silence had shattered, and the world was listening. The days that followed the broadcast of the hallway video unfolded like a slow-moving landslide, silent at first, then roaring. One by one, the walls that had held Kiara's truth at bay began to crumble under the weight of public scrutiny. It began with emails, then phone calls, then letters. They came from everywhere: journalists, former patients, hospital staff from all over the country. Some offered thanks. Some sought advice. Others confessed their own experiences: women and men, nurses and assistants, interns and orderlies. Kiara's story had unlocked something far beyond her own battle. It had become a reckoning. At Sterling Medical Pavilion, the atmosphere shifted from austere control to barely concealed panic. Staff, who had once walked with the quiet confidence of institutional backing, now moved briskly, heads lowered, as if trying to disappear into the wallpaper. Patients canceled appointments. Donors withdrew contributions. 2 nurses resigned publicly, stating they could not continue under an administration that failed its own. A third filed a complaint detailing her own experiences with harassment and racial bias during her employment, citing Kiara's bravery as her reason for coming forward. Dr. Harper, once the unshakable pillar of the clinic, found himself cornered in his own office. The board demanded an explanation. Cameras hovered near the clinic's entrance like vultures circling a wounded animal. When Harper tried to issue a carefully worded press release, minimizing the incident as a deeply unfortunate miscommunication, the internet erupted. Within hours, the hashtags returned, louder than before. #Believe Kiara, #Protect Nurses, #Sterling Silence. Under pressure from public health organizations and the mounting outcry, the clinic was forced to issue a statement acknowledging institutional failures and announcing a third-party investigation into its internal practices. But by then, it was too late. The damage was done. Kiara watched it all from the sidelines, not with satisfaction, but with the solemn recognition of justice inching forward, halting, imperfect, but real. It wasn't about watching them fall. It was about watching the world begin to see. Dylan remained in custody, denied bail after a second former nurse came forward, describing a similar pattern of behavior from the year prior. She had left quietly, ashamed and unsupported, but the resurfacing of Kiara's case gave her the courage to testify. The prosecution built a solid case. The DA spoke publicly, calling the footage indisputable evidence of an assault and of a failed institutional response. When Kiara was asked to appear in court to give her statement, she sat tall, met the eyes of the jury, and spoke with unwavering clarity. She didn't rehearse. She didn't need to. The truth was already woven into every fiber of her being. "I was not angry when I slapped him," she said calmly. "I was afraid. Afraid because no one listened. Afraid because I knew what would happen afterward. And I was right." The courtroom fell still. And even now, after everything, I don't want revenge. I want change. Her words, once dismissed in sterile meeting rooms and cold hallways, now echoed in spaces where decisions were made. The trial moved forward, but the public conversation had already leapt beyond it. Nursing unions called for national protocols protecting caregivers from patient harassment. Panels were held. Kiara was invited to speak at several, though she only accepted one, a closed-door symposium for young nurses of color entering the field. She stood before them, not as a symbol, but as someone who had survived the fire and emerged whole. Not unscathed, but stronger. Back at Sterling, the fallout deepened. Harper, after weeks of evasion, was formally dismissed by the board. The clinic's legal department cited gross misconduct, neglect of duty, and failure to enforce safety protocols. His final day passed without ceremony. No farewell party, no press release. Kiara received the news with a quiet nod. Harper had failed her, yes, but more than that, he had failed himself and the oath he once swore to uphold. In the wake of his departure, new interim leadership was appointed. One of the first acts was a full review of patient care protocols, staff grievance procedures, and harassment response policies. Anonymous reporting channels were reinstated. Cameras, which had once been selectively functional, were now monitored with accountability. Weekly sensitivity training was implemented. Staff were required to undergo racial bias awareness programs led by outside educators. Kiara was invited to attend a feedback session hosted by the new administration. She didn't go. Instead, she met with a representative from the city's largest public hospital, a facility known less for prestige and more for compassion. They had followed her story. The medical director, a black woman named Dr. Elaine Carter, reached out personally. "I saw what you did," she said. "We could use someone like you here. Not just on the floor, on the policy side. You know what needs to change, and I want to give you the space to do it." The offer was more than generous. A position as a senior coordinator for staff rights and safety, with a hybrid role that allowed her to split time between patient care and institutional reform. For the first time in months, Kiara allowed herself to consider a future, a real one, not built on fear or silence or survival, but purpose. She accepted. On her first day at the new hospital, she wore a navy blue blazer and carried a new badge clipped to her lapel. It read, "Kiara James, RN, Coordinator, Equity and Clinical Safety." She walked the halls not with apprehension, but with resolve. Nurses greeted her with open curiosity, some with familiarity. One whispered, "You're her, right?" "Thank you." She smiled, not to be polite, but because it felt earned. Later that afternoon, she stood in a staff orientation session speaking to a room full of young trainees. When someone crosses a line, speak. And when they don't listen, keep speaking. You may feel alone, but you're not. There are more of us than you think, and every time we say the truth out loud, the silence breaks a little more. When the session ended, applause filled the room, not thunderous but sincere. That night, in her apartment, Kiara sat with her mother and sister, a modest meal on the table, the windows open to let in the breeze. There was no talk of the trial, no news on in the background, just laughter, the clink of forks against plates, the soft music of belonging. She had not set out to change the system. She had only wanted to be heard, but in being heard, something larger had shifted, and though there were still battles ahead, she no longer walked alone. The morning light filtered gently through the hospital windows, bathing the corridor in a golden haze that softened the hum of machines and the occasional ringing of pagers. It was a new season, not just on the calendar, but in the air, in the way people moved through the world. There was a palpable difference now in how Kiara James carried herself down those halls. She was no longer just a nurse surviving on instinct and grit. She had become something else, an advocate, a voice, a presence that made silence impossible. Her days were split now, half in uniform, half in meetings. She would begin each morning reviewing staffing reports, reading through anonymous complaints from staff members, complaints that once would have been buried or dismissed. Now they had a place to land, a voice behind them. She met with teams to implement new safety protocols, advised leadership on how to handle emerging issues, and created frameworks for internal accountability. In the afternoons, she slipped into scrubs again, returned to the floor, and reminded herself why she had chosen this work to begin with. No title or desk could ever replace the quiet exchange of trust between nurse and patient, the simple dignity of care. She was respected now not as a symbol, but as a colleague. That respect had not come quickly or easily, but it had come, and it had brought with it something far more precious: credibility. Not the performative kind, not the kind handed out like a certificate, but the kind earned in fire and consequence. She had walked through ruin and rebuilt herself with her own hands. One afternoon, as she stepped out of an ethics committee meeting, she found a letter on her desk. It was a pale envelope, handwritten, not internal mail. The handwriting was shaky, unfamiliar. She opened it slowly, unfolding the paper with cautious fingers. "Miss James, you don't know me, but I know you. I saw the interview you gave, the one where you said you didn't want revenge. I cried that night. I had been working as a nurse in a long-term care facility when something happened to me, not unlike what happened to you. But I didn't speak. I told myself it wasn't worth the fight, that they wouldn't believe me, and they didn't. But after watching you, I made a choice. I left that job. I reported what happened, and even though it's hard, even though I don't know what comes next, I feel free. Thank you." It was signed simply, Andrea. Kiara sat with the letter for a long time. The words glowed in her chest like an ember, soft but steady. She had never wanted to be anyone's savior. She had wanted only to survive, to reclaim her name, her place. But if her truth had made space for someone else to find theirs, then it mattered. Her mother called that evening, as she often did now. They spoke about nothing important. What was for dinner, a new show she was watching, how the neighbors had planted too many roses again. But beneath the surface was something sacred: peace. Her mother's voice no longer carried the anxious tightness it once had. There was pride there now, quiet but unshakable. Her sister visited that weekend, bringing a bottle of wine and a stack of job applications. They spread the papers across Kiara's kitchen table, laughing as they edited resumes and imagined futures. "Look at you," her sister said, pointing to the framed certificate on the wall, replaced now, proudly displayed. "You did it." Kiara smiled. Not alone. In the weeks that followed, invitations began to arrive. Conferences, symposiums, educational panels. Kiara declined most of them. She had no interest in becoming a public figure. She didn't want to be on stage, but one event caught her eye. A regional seminar for healthcare institutions focusing on frontline safety and racial equity. It was to be attended by hospital administrators, nursing school faculty, and state policymakers. She agreed to go, not as a keynote speaker, just as a participant. A voice in the room. The day of the seminar, she dressed in simple charcoal slacks and a white blouse. She carried no speech, no prepared notes, just her experience and the clarity it had given her. When she stepped into the auditorium, the murmur of voices shifted. Some people recognized her, others only knew the story. She took her seat near the front, beside a middle-aged black nurse who leaned over and whispered, "We've been waiting for someone to say it for years." When Kiara was eventually asked to contribute during a roundtable discussion on institutional response and staff protection, she stood slowly, cleared her throat, and began. "You can write policies. You can host trainings. But if the people in charge don't believe the people who come forward, it's all performative. Institutions don't fail because they lack rules. They fail because they choose not to act." There was no applause, no fanfare, just a deep, collective silence of people hearing something they could not unhear. After the session, an administrator from a rural hospital approached her, looking overwhelmed. "I don't know how to fix our culture," he admitted, "but I want to try." "Then start by listening," she said. That night, Kiara walked out of the seminar into a city blanketed in soft rain. She didn't rush. Her bag slung over her shoulder, her shoes tapping lightly against the pavement. She felt weightless for the first time in a long while. She passed a bookstore, paused in front of the window, and smiled at the display. A title caught her eye: Quiet Power. She thought of the phrase and how it applied not only to introverts, as the book surely intended, but to all those who had learned to carry their strength in silence because the world wasn't ready for its sound. The world was more ready now. Weeks later, Kiara was in the hospital cafeteria finishing lunch when a nurse trainee approached her, looking nervous. "Can I ask you something?" the young woman said. "How do you do it? How do you keep going after what happened?" Kiara set down her fork and looked at her. "Because I remember why I started," she answered, "and I refuse to let fear decide where I end." The trainee nodded slowly, her eyes wide. "Thank you," she said. "I needed that." Afterward, Kiara returned to the ward, where a patient was waiting to have her IV changed. The woman smiled as Kiara entered, and Kiara smiled back. There was work to be done. Always. Later, as she stood near the window of her office, watching the city stretch and shift beneath her, she thought about everything it had taken to arrive here: the pain, the doubt, the cost, but also the strength, the clarity, the truth. She had not sought vengeance. She had not shouted to burn it all down. She had stood her ground, spoken her truth, and let it carry. Not all justice comes in thunder. Sometimes it walks in quietly and stays. If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe for more. Watch our next videos for more powerful stories and share this one to help the message reach even more people.